Good morning, everybody. We're about to start. Welcome to our second day of our conference on food and immigrant life. Today we'll continue the panel that we started yesterday. As you know, we had to shift the program around. So we'll continue the conversation on how food can provide an access for immigrants to enter the business world here in the US. And the panel will be moderated by my colleague, Alexandra Delano, who is the head of the Global Studies program here at the New School for Public Engagement. She has a lot of research and experience in studies on migrant, and actually she's got a fantastic book out on what's the title again?
Mexico and its diaspora in the United States.
Perfect. And it's a really good book. It really looks at those specific issues. So I'll leave the podium to Alexandra, who will moderate this session.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And it's a pleasure to be here and be part of this fantastic program that Arian and Fabio put together. So I congratulate them, and I'm really glad to be a part of it. So this is our panel, Food Business and the American Dream, Gateway or Obstacle. And as we heard yesterday, and hopefully many of you were here, the food service sector is one of the largest and fastest growing sectors of the economy and the largest employer of immigrants. At the same time, however, restaurant workers live on some of the lowest wages in the country and face exploitation at the workplace. So this panel has begun to explore last night what are some of the demands, opportunities, and constraints that migrant workers face in the food industry. And one of our panelists focused particularly on the case of women. Today, we'll continue that conversation, discussing how poor working conditions, discriminatory labor practices, exploitation, and unsanitary kitchens affect the meals that arrive at our restaurant tables. How do migrants adapt to the situations that they face, both at the workplace, at home, and in their communities? How are workers, employers, and organizations coming together to support fair wages and working conditions? These questions are particularly relevant today, now that the debate about immigration reform is front and center again. Today we are focusing specifically on issues of ethnic entrepreneurship, the situation of mobile food vendors, and in addition to the policy issues and advocacy work around them, we will also discuss aesthetic issues related to taste, beauty, and the relationship of migrants to food in this industry. Our panel has an impressive group of speakers, two of whom we have the pleasure of meeting today. It includes scholars, practitioners, community organizers with a wealth of experience in the advocacy, organizing, and research focused on these issues. So let me introduce first our speaker, Krishnendu Ray, who is an associate professor of food studies and chair of the Department of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health at NYU. His talk is titled The Immigrant Restaurateur and the American City: Taste, Toil, and the Politics of Inhabitants. Prior to joining the NYU faculty in 2005, he was a faculty member and an associate dean for curriculum development at the Culinary Institute of America from 1996. He's a food studies scholar and the author of The Migrant's Table: Meals and Memories in Bengali American Household, and co-editor of Curried Cultures, Globalization, Food, and South Asia. He is currently working on his next book-length project, tentatively titled Taste, Toil, and Ethnicity: Immigrant Restaurateur and the American City, sort of reflected in the title of his talk today. He also serves on the editorial board of the journal Food, Culture, and Society. And after his talk, I'll introduce Sean Basinski. So thank you very much for being here.
Go up there, right?
Yep.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for your patience. And in fact, I'm very happy that I'm not going up against Saru, because I heard her last night. It was I don't know how many of you heard that. It was explosively good. In the other side of it, I'm going to, in fact, talk about the other side of it. So first, thank you, Arian, and thank you, Fabio, for this fantastic programming that you guys have been doing. And in fact, puts the NYU Food Studies program on the defensive, I'm beginning to get a sense that we are just not good enough, and that's thanks to Fabio's initiative here. Thanks, Alexandra. And so what I'm going to talk about today is I have a lot of material. I'm going to read a little. I have some visual material, and we have this extraordinary situation for an academic conference that we have more time than usual, so that's going to be lovely, but I don't want to go on and on. So when you're bored, if you're bored, raise your hand and I'll stop. So my talk today is called Immigrant Restaurateur in the American City, Politics of Inhabitants. Since occupations and birthplace have been identified, beginning with the 1850 Census of the United States, data shows a strong correlation between food service occupations and new immigrant groups. Foreign-borns have numerically dominated certain occupations, such as domestic servants, hotel and restaurant employees, hotel keepers, saloon keepers, and bartenders, and traders and dealers in groceries, bakers, and butchers. In contrast, members of the so-called white-collar occupations, such as clergy, lawyers, school teachers, and government officials have mostly been native-born. I'm wondering how much you can see of that. The red one is New York City, and the blue one is USA and all. This is 1860 data. I'll just jump because otherwise the story gets very long. So I'll jump about in 50-year increments to just give you a sense of the broad outline that most of us know now intuitively and from our everyday experience. In fact, I was surprised by some of this data when I looked back at the historical material. For instance, to give you an example, in this one, the physicians and surgeons, that 50% of physicians and surgeons in 1860 in New York City were foreign-born. I thought that would be a more recent phenomena, and say Filipinos, South Asians, etc. But this was mostly German and Irish. And of course, this is just before modern medicine takes off in terms of its as a kind of skill that is taught in the school. It goes up in income, goes up in prestige. That happens right after the Civil War, and part of it is linked, of course, to developments in medicine. So when I, for instance, saw the data on physicians and surgeons, that surprised me. But on the other side, if you look at the data on lawyers, it is understandable why lawyers tend to be most native-born. It's usually professions depending on linguistic skills. And restaurant shares with that. Lawyers, school teachers tend to be, in fact, the least foreign-born. School teachers, of course, are, in fact, important agents of what used to be called assimilation. If you look at the other end of it, you see bakers, brewers, and maltsters and butchers. And for instance, I was surprised how many butchers were foreign-born and bakers and continue to be for the length of time. So in New York City in 1860, for instance, 70% of hotel keepers and 100% of restaurant keepers are foreign-born. By the way, hotel keepers, restaurant keepers are the names given in the census, so that's why I'm using them. Mostly of Irish and German heritage. 50 years later, according to the 1900 census, 63% of hotel and restaurant employees were foreign-born, where the Irish and the German predominate, and 65% of hotel keepers were foreign-born, mostly German. Restaurant keepers, a newly significant occupation by 1900, were 67% foreign-born, where about 50% of the population of New York was foreign-born. Even by the 1950 census, after immigration had subsided, partly because of the changes in the law, partly because of transformations in the economy, 64% of restaurant cooks were foreign-born, Italians now at the top, followed by Greeks, Chinese, and Germans. According to the 2000 census, that trend continued with 75% of restaurant cooks and 64% of restaurant workers in New York City foreign-born. But the dominant countries and regions of origin were now Mexico, Central America, Caribbean Basin, South America, China, and the old USSR. That's the experience we are familiar with. We know all around us. So although, and here's my argument, although the journalistic material is replete with stories of immigrant restaurateurs, there is surprisingly little academic work that theoretically engages with taste in the metropolis from the point of view of the immigrant entrepreneur, which, as I will show, can contribute much to our theories and methodologies. There's, of course, a rich seam of literature on ethnic entrepreneurship, yet much of the ethnicity and the entrepreneurship literature attends to economics and politics, as if immigrants are creatures only of political economy who never think about taste, beauty, and how such things might intersect with their practical moral universe. So the propensity to ignore immigrant aesthetics in the disciplinary discussion of taste may be a product, I think, of the tendency to see taste as marginal to the real lives of marginal people. In this conception, poor, hardworking people can teach us about poverty and suffering, hierarchy and symbolic violence, but never about taste. As a consequence, I think taste loses its contested and dynamic character. If we do pay attention to immigrant aesthetics, and here aesthetics, taste in the double sense of palatal taste and taste, of course, as notions of beauty, we will find robust transactions in taste across ethnic, racial, and spatial boundaries where the agentic activity of the immigrant entrepreneur is both crucial and yet rarely accounted for in the theoretical literature. So I'll give you one illustration through this talk. I'll use one illustration that is kind of both obvious and surprisingly under-interrogated. And here I'm calling this section, What's in a Name? Okay? An illustration of immigrant agency. So the process of designing a restaurant can begin with the mere act of naming it. There's a reason why, and I'll use an example. There's a reason why the first Indian restaurant, say established in 1913 in New York City, is named Ceylon India Inn. And subsequently, all 4 Indian restaurants listed in the Manhattan Telephone Directory by 1949 are named India Bengal Garden, India Prince, India Raja, India Restaurant. At the dawn of post-colonial nationalism, such native characterization must have made sense both to the South Asian entrepreneurs and American customers. Perhaps that is why the categorization of India Raja under the class Hindu in a 1939 New York Times Classifieds did not have staying power. Hindu, by the way, was a census category used from 1910 to 1940 to classify Indians who were Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, or Parsi. In the case of the India Raja, the owner wasn't Hindu. The chef de cuisine was Ali Jan of Benares, according to 2 sources. It took a while for the public and the experts to develop the necessary distinctions between Indian, Hindu, Parsi, Turkish, and Arab, as evidenced by the following confusion in an early restaurant guide from New York City titled Dining in New York by Rian James, 1930. The Raja, classified as a Turkish and in parentheses Parsi restaurant in the 1930 edition, located on west of Broadway on 48th Street, is described as a place where, I quote, a dingy little red sign swings high over the stoop of an erstwhile aristocratic brownstone front. Upstairs you will find the Raja, about as big as a medium-sized clothes press, and not nearly as sanitary. Is that persistent kind of a theme about ethnic and unclean. But you're in Turkey now, and this is the quote that continues, and if you were terribly fussy, you wouldn't have gone to Turkey in the first place. Besides, the food is worth the trip, end quote. The food is described then as, and here is I just broken it up into, it's a long quote to read it out. The table d'hôte starts with tamarind, a lemon-colored drink made from vegetables as an appetizer. A watery, albeit true to type, native soup follows. I wonder what that is. What do you think? A watery, albeit true to type, native soup follows. Dal, probably. Then the real business of the Turkish dinner sets in. Choose lamb, chicken, or beef curry. Oh, such a fiery curry sauce. A heaping plate of rice with an ample portion of cabbage is placed beside your curry. The trick is to pour your curried meat into a little well of the rice, mix thoroughly, and then enjoy. That, by the way, is pretty good advice. You will enjoy your dinner speculating about the other queer-looking diners and learn, astonishingly enough, that not all sheikhs don't wear goatees, ride white horses, and brandish swords. End of quote. Right? In ranging widely, James conflates the Arab world with Turkey and India in a classic case of early 20th century Orientalism. Some of the comestibles, such as the drink called tamarind, appear in contradictory guise in different sources. Robert Dana, author of Where to Eat in New York, published in 1948, writes about it as pomegranate nectar, which is, I quote, a sweet beverage boiled from the tamarind roots that grow on Indian riverbanks, end quote. This is pomegranate nectar. Despite confusing two different fruits with very different taste profiles, tamarind and pomegranate, and displacing the fruit with the root of the tamarind, he did add the local color of, I quote, growing on Indian riverbanks in a desperate attempt at verisimilitude. There was a lovely move. Yet, that parenthetical Parsi in the classification of the Raja was too specific to be ignored. When I first ran into the reference, I wondered what a Parsi, who is a Zoroastrian exile from Persia to India, was doing in Manhattan with a Turkish restaurant that had an Indian name, the Raja, that advertised itself as Hindu in the classifieds of 1939 New York Times. From a number of other sources, I learned that the Raja was once owned by Rustam Wadia, a Parsi from Bombay, Mumbai now, who came to the US in 1923 to study engineering at Union College in Schenectady, New York. He ate his first Indian meal in an Indian restaurant in Manhattan around the transportation hub in Midtown, eventually becoming its co-owner in 1926, taking it over fully in 1944. So the name, the Raja, the provenance of the food, and the sign under which it was served all had to be slowly sorted out over decades of transactions between immigrant proprietors, their own classificatory systems, engaging with real and imagined customers, and those of American newspaper critics, commentators and advertisers, and guidebook writers before the people and the food could be put in their mutually comprehensible category. So what appear at first glance to be mere errors of classification are in fact traces of a process of transaction in type. By 1959, India can still be found in some of the restaurant names, such as Bombay, India, Ceylon, India, in Pakistan, India, etc. But by the end of the 1960s, you have subnational places and added to the repertoire like Punjab, Karachi, Rajmahal, Kohinoor, and Nataraj. Yet clear national identifiers had to be positioned in small print underneath the names, such as unique Pakistani or Indian cuisine under Rajmahal, or authentic Indian curries under Punjab. By 1979, new restaurants such as Raga, Mumtaz, Nirvana, Shaheen, and Tandoor no longer needed India in their names, as the entrepreneur and the audience began to figure each other out, sometimes with the intermediation of critics. Perhaps the category also had become overcrowded. By 1989, Dawat, which is the last name on this slide, had to both explain itself and pull itself into gastronomic discourse by claiming, I quote, Dawat means invitation to a feast. And they argued that they served, I quote, the haute cuisine of India under the culinary supervision of Madhur Jaffrey, who has been called the finest authority on Indian cooking in America by Craig Claiborne, end quote. They managed to say all that in their tiny little advertisement in the 9X yellow pages. We no longer have those, but those of you who are old enough to remember, you can imagine how big those ads are, and all that is stated in this tiny little ad. So in fact, much of this history of transactions in type, which I'm calling, was reticulated through the simple question I had asked one of the restaurateurs I interviewed, Muhammad Rasul, and I asked him, so how did you come to name your place Bread and Butter? Muhammad Rasul said, you see, I used to call it Taj Mahal, but my business was not working. One day I had fallen asleep on the long commute home. The train jolted to a halt. I woke up and looked around, which is when it came to me. no one, not one person in this compartment knows what Taj Mahal is. So to make my business run, I had to change the name to Bread and Butter. I don't care if he's delusional. What I'm interested in is, that's the perspective I'm interested in, which is from the perspective of the entrepreneur. How does he read his audience? And how does he act on it, on that kind of knowledge? And in some ways, much more in terms of the phenomenology of it, rather than the objective truth of it, which is whether more people know bread and butter than Taj Mahal, I'm not sure. Okay, but that's his understanding, and I'm really interested in that, and I'll explain why. So, in fact, one of the questions that was not in my original survey that turned out to be one of the most productive questions was this, some version of it, which is, if you could change this place to make it your dream place, what would you do? In fact, I was surprised how nobody had, in fact, very rarely had they been asked those kinds of questions. Everybody had asked about the economics of it, about authenticity always, but about, so if you had whatever you wanted to do with this place, what would you do? I will put a small stand there with 3 containers of soup, he said. I'll sell cheap soup, self-service soup, pita bread, and put a grill there at the window on the sidewalk, he pointed. Serve shawarma, chicken shawarma, lamb shawarma. I'll put the clay oven, the tandoor there. I'll put a young guy with a cap, he was saying, you know, a cap like that, so a toque on his head. We will just have meats in the tandoor, salads, and soups. I'll call it Pakistani grill. If I was permitted in Islam to sell liquor, maybe as an exception, I open a big restaurant, still an Indian Pakistani place, but beautiful, like an American place, end quote. So Rasul would rebuild his corner of the city, pushing the glass front out, putting the grill on the sidewalk, pursuing his customers with dreams of soup, salad, and shawarma. He could turn this into a generic Middle Eastern place, at some distance from South Asia, but successfully playing between the scope of his ecumenical Islamic imagination and the confused compass of his audience's geography. What we also get here is a trace of the agentic activity of the immigrant restaurateur struggling to name and define their project under discursive pressures of conceptions of taste and its relationship to race that pins them down into a category that is comprehensible from the perspective of those who govern, census, think about the Hindu category, and the public that counts, which is of course customers and critics. So furthermore, the logic of naming Indian restaurants in New York appears to be distinct from that of the Chinese restaurants on one hand, and French restaurants on the other, revealing their spatial and in fact social location. The first recorded cluster of 11 Chinese restaurants in New York City in 1898, for instance, was named Hon Hyong Lao, Mi Hyong Lao, King Hyong Lao, Wei Hyong Lao, etc., all on Mott and Pell Street in Chinatown in Lower Manhattan, marking their insider audience and maybe subaltern status. Until the last quarter of the 20th century, the Indian population in the United States was too small and dispersed to support enclave eateries such as we find among the Chinese. Equally outwardly oriented, but sending off signals of much higher status, were elite restaurants on the first half of the 20th century, which invariably had French names such as Le Pavillon, La Côte Basque, La Caravelle, Lutèce, etc., leading the New York restaurateur Drew Neperon to characterize it as the la phase of American fine dining. So what I'm pointing to here is the mere names of restaurants can provide a rich record of social location and, in fact, transaction in taste. Of course, as we move from naming to judging, on March 12, 1939, we have one of the earliest critical discussions of curry in the context of gourmandise in an article by Charlotte Hughes in the New York Times. It goes into a long and sophisticated discussion with the promising opening, I quote, "Curry is a very ancient dish, antedating hollandaise sauce and apple pie by centuries," end quote. It asserts that, I quote, "curry has come to be a lot more popular in New York in the last few years, with curry restaurants springing up here and there and with hotels putting curry dishes on their menus." This is written in 1939. She goes on to elaborate that curry powder is a blend of 15 or 20 spices that needs proper blending, as explained by Dharmadasa of the East India Curry Shop. In 1946, Jane Nickerson, another New York Times reporter, depended in fact on the proprietor of the same shop to explain curry. Excuse me. Getting an answer colored by the typical exaggeration and bravado that a native informant displays towards what he constructs to be a naive American. 15 to 20 spices, Dharamdasa says. I don't know about you, when anybody asks me questions about authenticity and stuff like that, I always inflate as a native informant. It's kind of a part of this claiming legitimacy in this exchange. In 1948, an anonymous American reporter depended on C.V. Deva, an import-export trader, a transplanted native of Lahore and proprietor of India Prints, to unpack the mystery of curry. Until about 1961, an authoritative native informant is always invoked in discussions of Indian food by the New York Times. Craig Claiborne, often consecrated as the first American restaurant critic, depended initially on the exotic housewife as his tour guide. In his 1960 piece on Indian food, Claiborne relied on Manorama Phillips. This article is, in fact, accompanied by a 6-by-6-inch photograph of Miss Phillips in her apartment, clad in a sari and framed by exquisite Indian handcrafted textiles. Here is the brown body as evidence of authenticity. I don't know about you. When I go to an Indian restaurant, I see a lot of Indians eating there. I know it's an authentic place. Furthermore, words need the aid of pictures, and pictures the help of a body, clothing, sari, artifact to produce meaning, which in fact is a very post-Heideggerian point, where subjects and the environment of things and other bodies, in fact, are inseparable. It points to the ratio of configuration between immigrant bodies, urban demand, and cosmopolitan gastronomic dialogue that goes into the construction of a discourse barely hammered into place by numerous performers with real and borrowed authority. So to conclude, I have to say a few things. I pay attention to immigrant restaurateurs because they are players of some consequence, granted not dominance, in the emerging gastronomic world of star chefs, print media critics, commentators, and celebrity bloggers. The exclusion of immigrant restaurateurs in most theoretical discussions evacuates, I think, the very center of urban culinary production and fails to capture the most dynamic dimensions of the new urban culture. I also make an argument for a new sensory urbanism that pays attention to issues of habit and inhabitants in a new locale by drawing on a highly suggestive work of the Lebanese-American student of Bourdieu named Ghassan Haj. Haj critiques the obsessive cultural acquisitiveness of gastronomic cosmopolitans who cannot see beyond the feeding function of the ethnic feeders, thereby producing a multiculturalism without migrants, which is linked to the international circulation of gastronomic conceptions rather than the circulation of migrants. For gastronomic cosmopolitans, ethnicity is an object of experience rather than an experiential subject. To cosmo-multiculturalism, Haj counterposes the multiculturalism of inhabitants, of real migrants, in complex, sometimes conflictual relationship, but always in negotiation with white folks and not so white others. That is a place where ethnicity is not detached from ethnic producers. The evidence of immigrant designs on the city is there, but often inaudibly and always smothered in a stupor of objects. Much of the city is made and remade by people too busy to spend time contemplating what they do and have done. The advantage of ethnographic work and interviews, of course, is the recovery of fragile orality that documentary history cannot bear witness to. Even those reduced to documentary illegibility are not silent. This essay is an argument for, in fact, a productive kind of interdisciplinarity, even in our methods. It is our task to recover the work of those who have traversed the city absently, as it were, lost in thought or worry. This work focuses on the otherwise preoccupied ethnic restaurateur because she's the hinge between taste and toil, consumption and work, two streams of theoretical accounts that are put in productive conversation here. Finally, it is the social friction, I think, of a body in motion that makes the naturalized body visible. Thus, the immigrant is the focus of this work, not only because she has been absent from the discussion of taste, but also because she reveals more clearly what cannot be seen in grounded native practices. This is, in fact, the opposite of the classical anthropological operation. An immigrant, in fact, is an inverted anthropologist who deals practically with the problems of the body out of place. Much has been written about the problems of the anthropological project. In contrast, very little has been theorized about the epistemological consequences of the intrusion of immigrant bodies into metropolitan spaces and what that might do to our concepts and methods of inquiry. There are lots of studies of immigrants. There are lots of studies what immigrants do, rarely to what kind of epistemological challenges to, in fact, force the rest of us in the academy to engage with. So the study of a potentially embodied object such as food from the point of view of the immigrant is capable, I think, of generating epistemic implosions, where a whole set of knowledges that have been disqualified as inadequate to their task or insufficiently elaborated, naive knowledges located low down on the hierarchy, beneath the required level of cognition or scientificity, can come alive and burn our fingers. Cooking also opens up the possibilities of what de Soto has characterized as an economy of gift, an aesthetics of tricks, and an ethics of tenacity that upgrades ordinary practices to the status of theoretical objects. So, the ethnic entrepreneur in the heart of the Western metropolis conceives and offers the flavors of our people's experience by designing a small, semi-public space and a menu, by hiring and managing the skilled hands that can reproduce her recipes. Such choreography is undertaken in the shadow of white Anglophone demand, which nonetheless never overwhelms it. So I have here tried to recover some of that elbow room made by immigrant entrepreneurs of taste. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fascinating analysis and history. I was particularly fascinated by this idea of how ethnic entrepreneurs or immigrants perceive their customers or their audience, and how they interpret that not only in the names of the restaurants, but also in the food they make, the way in which they interpret their relationship with the, in this case, the other side. So I look forward to a discussion about this in the Q&A. And now we're moving into a discussion about street vendors. And Sean Basinski is going to talk about hipsters and hot dogs, immigrants selling food in public space. Sean is a founder and director of the Street Vendor Project, a member-based advocacy group for vendors' rights at the Urban Justice Center. In 1998, before law school, Sean sold burritos from the corner of 52nd Street and Park Avenue. In 2009, he spent 7 months researching and writing about the informal economy as a Fulbright scholar in Lagos, Nigeria. And the Street Vendor Project, with about 1,000 active members, seeks to increase justice and respect for everyone who sells food and merchandise on the streets and sidewalks of New York City. Members believe that vendors bring life to the streets and safety to communities, and seeks more licenses, more public space for vending, and less harassment. Thank you, Sean.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to come, to Fabio and Ariel for inviting me. A couple things. First of all, I I threw out my back a couple days ago, so if I wince at any time, I should be okay. I'm on some Percocet, but if I make a funny face at any time, especially funny, it's just my back flaring up. Let me see if I can take this out. Will it? Is that fine? Okay, great. Amazing technology. So I'm not an academic. I'm a lawyer and a community organizer and a former vendor. So I'm really, I feel really privileged to be here at a fancy conference like this, talking to you all and also learning from you all and giving you a little picture of what we do at the Street Vendor Project every day. I'm also not especially a foodie. I eat pizza about 5 times a week at the same place down the block. So you might wonder what I'm doing here, but it so happens, you know, I sold burritos on the street, and then I started an organization that works with food and works with immigrants, and so I've been doing that for about 11 years now. I don't have any fancy paper, but I put together a slideshow riffing off of one that we normally use, and I'll go through it. First of all, I'm just going to go through, as an introduction, a little bit about who street vendors are, food vendors here in New York City, and then what we do at the Street Vendor Project, and then I'll touch about a few things that I think are particularly relevant to this topic, which is why vendors matter as immigrants. Okay. Oh, by the way, we're trying to get more Twitter followers. So please, you know, go ahead and tweet about us and not friend us, follow us. Friend us on Facebook, please. Tweet about us as I'm talking here so I can see it back at the office later. All right. So first of all, as you all know, the history of New York City is very much tied to the history of street vendors. A survey was done in 1920 that found that there were 25,000 vendors on the street. We all know about the history of the Lower East Side and how the history of that neighborhood is tied to vendors, but really they were all over the place, starting downtown when really downtown was a marketplace. In the 20s, the survey said I think 80% of vendors were Jewish, mostly Eastern European Jews. Another 10% or so were Italian. They mostly sold fruits and vegetables. And then there were a few Spanish vendors in there. So the vendors that you see out there on the street a half a block away are, you know, really direct descendants of the people that we see in all the old pictures. Why, even back then, were so many vendors immigrants? A few reasons we can imagine. One, in New York, we have the density of people here that support a vibrant vending scene. You need a certain number of people to be walking past your table or push cart in order to make a viable business. This is why we don't see a lot of vendors out in the suburbs, right? Also, vendors back then, as now, although it's changed a little bit now, the vendors were immigrants and they were selling mostly to immigrants. The vendors were poor people, low-income people who were selling to poor immigrants as well. And so there was a familiarity there, both with the things that were being offered that were familiar to the people that were buying them, and also these people on the Lower East Side were poor. The prices on the street were less expensive than the prices in the stores because of the overhead that the vendors had was much lower. So if you're really struggling and you need to buy something, you get it from the street. Of course, many of the vendors from, as we know, again, many of the vendors from back then who started on the street grew into storefronts, and now those businesses are very big. D'Agostino's was originally a push cart on the Lower East Side, and I just read that Fairway, which just IPO'd, is now worth $500 million, I read. Also got its start as a push cart. Goldman Sachs, the guy, whoever the guy's name was who started Goldman Sachs, got to start as a vendor, you know, Bloomingdale's, whole history there. So who are the people that are vendors now today? It's not that guy anymore. People like Mrs. Tam here. She's one of our members. She sells on Canal Street. Notice that the vegetables she sells are not things that I even know the names of. I mean, maybe that's bok choy there, but maybe somebody else can name that thing up top there. I think somebody said bitter melon or something, I don't know. Not familiar to me, but obviously familiar to the people that she's selling to on Canal Street. We're very lucky. Working with vendors is a very, very diverse group. And so, unlike some other immigrant worker populations that we know about, which are primarily one ethnicity or one background, we work with folks from all over the world. And it makes it hard. We do our meetings every month in 5 languages, which is crazy, but also I think really special and really powerful if we can overcome those barriers. This is Maria out in Sunset Park, selling Ecuadorian food. Here's her cart, just a shopping cart. No permit, there are no permits available. Maria doesn't let that stop her. She's selling Ecuadorian food there, probably to Ecuadorian people, I'm guessing, or even people that like Ecuadorian food in that neighborhood. And then this is Munu Dewan, originally from Bangladesh. He doesn't sell Bangladeshi food, he sells hot dogs. Many of our Bangladeshi vendors sell hot dogs. We say to them, why don't you sell Bangladeshi food? We would really love to have Bangladeshi food. And they say, nobody likes Bangladeshi food. Everybody loves hot dogs. Now, Munu doesn't eat hot dogs. He eats Bangladeshi food that he brings from home every day. But he's convinced that hot dogs it's a little bit like bread and butter, you know. To him, hot dogs represent, well, a business opportunity at least, and what people like in this country. Well, this guy's not one of our members. What's he doing in there? I just wanted to have the slide in there to show that in New York City, we've got about 10,000 food vendors. We also, by the way, work with people who sell merchandise. But today we're talking about food. You got about 10,000 food vendors, give or take. Nobody really knows. People like Maria are unlicensed. It's hard to have a count of them. The city's never counted vendors. But let's say 10,000 food vendors in New York, another 10 or so thousand in LA and Chicago, and if you add it all up, it gets to be a decent-sized number across the country, but nothing compared to what the number of vendors there are in the rest of the world. And so the movement for street vendors is much more powerful in other cities and countries, and this gentleman, I took a picture of him last time I was in India, and in fact there's an organization that does work similar to what we do here called NASVI, the National Association of Street Vendors of India. We're actually very proud to be a part of a global movement. There's an organization that's based in South Africa called StreetNet. We are the US affiliate. It's got about 40 different affiliates around the world, vendor organizations, and we work together. There was just a big conference down in Chile a week or so ago where we elected the president, a guy from Argentina. So moving on to the street vendor project. I'm not an immigrant. I was a guy from the suburbs, but I happened to sell. On a whim, sort of. I'm not sure what I was thinking. I wanted to have my own business, and I was kind of between college and law school, so I sold burritos on the street. And then when I was in law school, I realized that there was a real need and a real opportunity here to organize a group that had never been organized, and as a new lawyer to provide some legal services to folks who had no legal services. And so I was able to raise a little bit of money and start the Street Vendor Project. That was 11 years ago now. It was actually right after September 11th. My first thing, I just walked around on the street. Downtown, they were preventing vendors from going back to work. Even though the streets have been opened up, they were stopping vendors sometimes at Canal Street and saying, no, you can't go downtown. Well, in fact, there was a great need for vendors. The stores often had not opened up yet, and so vendors are flexible. They can fill these needs when they arise. and yet they had no voice. They were, you know, what do you say to the police when they say, no, you can't go below canal? This is a shot of our leadership board. So I'm on staff. We've got a staff of 4 people, but our leaders are elected by our members every year. We've got about 1,500 members, and in September we have our elections. So these are the people who are the leaders of the organization. They set our agenda and they drive our campaigns. So going through a few things, what does the Street Vendor Project do? I've got a few slides here. First of all, we try to do training to let folks know how to follow the vending rules and what to do when the police or the health department come and harass you. So sort of a know your rights training. The rules are very complicated, and so it's no surprise that vendors don't understand them. They're only given to, the vendors only receive the regulations, which is a book about yay thick in English. And so the city should be doing it, but we spend a lot of time trying to interpret those, translate those into a language that the vendors can understand, and so that they can abide by the rules in the first place before we get to other things. That's a guide that we produce. We've got some outside. It's also in 5 languages. Most of what we do is organize for change, for more power, and oftentimes that comes as a result of different attacks, I hate to say it, but attacks by the city that make it hard for vendors to operate their businesses. This is a shot from a news conference we did, a press conference we did a few years ago. One of our vendors came in, a peanut vendor, and the health department had come and scratched the permit off of his peanut cart, and so he was out of work. And we called the health department to figure out what had happened, and they said, yeah, well, there's a new rule that vendors cannot leave their push carts unattended. And we said, well, that's, we didn't know about that rule. That's an unusual rule, and that's kind of difficult for vendors to follow, because how are they going to go to the bathroom? I mean, some vendors have somebody next to them that can watch their cart, but some vendors aren't so lucky. So it's unusual that the health department would be passing that rule. It's very unhealthy for people not to be able to go to the bathroom, to be in fear of leaving their spot. If they do leave for a minute to use the facilities, they might lose their permit. That's what happened to one of our peanut vendors, according to this new rule, that the health department had just not thought, I think, very carefully about. They said that they were concerned with food safety, that if vendors left their carts unattended, there could be terrorists or somebody that could come and poison the peanuts. You know, I know you guys know more about food than I do, but when we thought about that, we thought, well, would that really be the best way to poison you know, I think I would go to the salad bar at my supermarket if I was going to. It'd be a lot easier than waiting for the peanut vendor to step away for a few minutes. But one of the reasons that the city is able to get away with these things is vendors have never had a voice, and one of the reasons vendors have never had a voice is because vendors are immigrants. You know, we act in a way like a PR firm, I think, for the vending community. Always there's just something in the news that comes up, you know. If it's not the styrofoam ban, then they were calling us about the soda ban. And in every neighborhood around the city at different times, somebody is complaining about vendors. And so we just feel a lot of phone calls and get to do a lot of press appearances to provide some voice to counter the people who are complaining. By the way, one of the complaints, to give you a sense of what we're up against, and to give you a sense, and to tie it into the theme about immigration, in the paper just last week, there was the community board on the Upper East Side was complaining about vendors, as they usually are, or as a few of the people in that community board usually are. And one of the women said that she was very offended that the vendor outside of her fancy building was washing his feet. This was a Muslim vendor who was washing his feet before he went to pray, and she thought that that was really disgusting. That he would be doing that so close to her apartment, You know, now it was outside on the sidewalk, but that's sort of Islamophobia, xenophobia, and racism is really what we're up against as a vending community. People who just don't think it's appropriate to be selling on the street. It's just not right. They should get stores, those people, you know. That's what we deal with. We do events as well. This is a shot from the Vendy Awards some of you may have heard about. Big fundraiser we do every September. You guys are certainly invited. The ticket's not cheap, though. We use it as a fundraiser for the work we do, and it's a celebration of vendors. We have a cook-off to see who is the best street food vendor, and we do it in New York now, and we're also doing the Vendy Awards in LA and in Philadelphia. We just did it in New Orleans. So it's really a way to tie together the different vending communities around the country and spread a real respect of street food, and especially street food vendors, the people that are out there every day and never get recognized. So what do you want, you street vendor project? What are you asking for as policy changes? So we got a couple of them here. Number one, more licenses and permits. The number of licenses and permits has been capped by the city 30 years ago. People said there's too many vendors out there. That leads now to either a very long waiting list, 20 years or more to get into business on your own, or you can buy a permit on the black market, which is illegal, and the price is going up, so that's an additional barrier. That's why Maria, by the way, she doesn't have a permit. You saw her before with the shopping cart. She can't afford $20,000, safe to say, which is what a permit costs now for 2 years. A lot cheaper than opening a restaurant. Somebody said it's $1 million in New York City to open a restaurant. So, you know, 20,000 is a lot cheaper, but a lot of people, especially our immigrants, don't have that, as you guys well know. A lot of what we deal with is got to do with the fight for public space, right? In New York City, the space is very valuable, and it's a big question of who controls that space. Oh, more respect. Who controls that space? Is it the big businesses and the real estate lobby who want the street to look a certain way? Or is it the people, the public, and people, people like this vendor who are selling outside? We've had a big problem with the AOL Time Warner building, Ratner Real Estate Company, I think it is. And they've actually succeeded in getting a law passed now that will ban these vendors from that area. Really, though, what we just want is a catch-all, more respect. There's a million ways this comes through. One little example, when you lose your, let's say you lose your vending license or it gets stolen or whatever it is, you go down to, you can't work unless you have that license, and so you go down to renew it at the Consumer Affairs Department. This thing's out of control. They say, okay, yeah, well, you know, go home, we'll send it to you in the mail. It'll take about a month. So in the meantime, you can't work as a vendor. So can anyone imagine that happening, for example, for driver's licenses? Imagine if you lost your driver's license and then you couldn't drive, you know? I'm pretty sure, like, they give you some sort of a temporary driver's license while you're waiting for your real one to come in the mail. And if they didn't, well, people would complain, you know, people in power would be able to complain about that. With vendors, it's just par for the course, and that's one, that's not even on our list of top 10 problems. So it's ridiculous that it takes a month when you lose your license to get back to work, but that's one example. More respect, more consideration into the process that determines the rules and the enforcement of those rules that affect people's lives. Now I want to talk about a few different examples that, I don't expect you to read that, by the way, but a few different examples that we've seen that I think will show not just why many street vendors are immigrants, but also how they are treated as immigrants differently, how I would be treated differently as a vendor than most of our vendors are. By the way, 99% of street food vendors in New York City are immigrants, probably 99.5. our biggest groups in terms of food vendors, we talked about Bangladeshis. We have a lot of Ecuadorians and Mexicans. We have a lot of Egyptians and Moroccans. We have a certain number of Chinese food vendors, and then it's a mixture from there. Belgians. I'm sorry? Belgians. The Belgians are coming. So a few years ago, we started to get a lot of calls from some of our members on Forsyth Street in Chinatown. There's one block there where some vendors went because they got kicked out of every place else in Chinatown and started selling very inexpensive fruits and vegetables to the local community. And we started getting calls about so many tickets, tickets after tickets from the vendors there. And we said, what in the world's going on? So we went by, we asked the city for the data. It took a while, but it turned out that on this one block of Forsyth Street, the 5th Precinct mostly, had given 1,000 tickets the prior year to the vendors. And we said, what is going on? And why are these tickets being written for? You know, is this like a serious violation? After all, these people are selling fruits and vegetables. What could they possibly be doing wrong? And so then we looked into what happens on Forsyth Street, which is, they're categorized as street vendors, but it's basically like a fruit and vegetable market, which is a good thing, right? Sort of like a green market. And we compared that to what happens at Union Square Green Market, some of the practices there. So that top slide is a violation of the vending rules. You're not allowed to do that. You have to sell from a proper table or cart. So that's actually the most ticketed offense on Forsyth Street. It's a certain section of the administrative code that says you can only, so you can't have boxes next to your cart. You know, I mean, in some respects you might say this makes sense. You can't take over the whole sidewalk with your vending merchandise. But, you know, on Forsyth Street, it's the only people that actually really go there. You would only go there if you're buying fruits and vegetables, unless, you know. So what's the real harm? Or why is another way of putting it, you know, why is the city going after these people who are doing their job selling fruits and vegetables, mostly to low-income people, mostly to immigrants in Chinatown? Why is that a $1,000 ticket potentially? And then we went to Union Square Green Market, and we saw really the very same thing, not a violation. Union Square Green Market, a very upper-class kind of clientele. The idea, you know, these are local farmers, mostly white people selling, mostly middle-class and upper-class white people who are buying. So we have a guy who actually was in our office just yesterday. He can't work now because he got so many tickets on Forsyth Street for violations, mostly for this violation, in fact, that now his license was taken away and he's out of work. And he comes to our office because he has nowhere else to go. So I can't find any justice in that. I can't find any reason for that or any justice there. Sorry. So a lot of people ask me about the new food trucks. The food truck craze is really interesting. It's been going on, you know, for a few years more or less. And how that's affected our traditional immigrant vendors. The answer I usually give is not very much, to tell you the truth. I mean, just in terms of numerically speaking, there's maybe 100 or so of these fancy new food trucks. Pardon me, but there's at least 5,000 permitted vendors, and so it's a drop in the bucket, numerically speaking. Now everybody thinks there's like, it's half the population of vendors. Maybe on the food blogs, it's the majority of vendors. The new food trucks are getting the attention. But numerically speaking, it's not such a big deal. But there are definitely some effects and I think some interesting things going on that we're going to want to be aware of. This is just a picture I found of, this is Van Leeuwen ice cream truck on the left there with a long line. They have like, you know, some sort of organic, homemade, you know, it's really good, I have to say. A delicious ice cream, but it's a locally owned, locally sourced, sort of gourmet ice cream truck. And then on the right there is a Mr. Softy. Poor Mr. Softy doesn't have the business. Yeah. So one of the things that has happened, though, is the influx of the fancy food trucks has driven up the price of permits. They used to be about $10,000. Now the going rate's the $20,000 I mentioned. And that's affecting everyone. And there was a hearing actually on Wednesday. This is Councilman Dan Garodnick, who is chaired a hearing where the city's talking about establishing parking spots for the food trucks. Sounds good. Now they have nowhere to park. It's very difficult for them. But then the city said something about, oh, well, actually, we are thinking of doing a trial program where we auction off those spaces. So well, that's a real problem. That's the privatization of public space by definition, which is offensive. But for our vendors, it means that most of our vendors won't be able to afford to get that space, but the better capitalized vendors will, with investors and business plans and that kind of thing. And you know, so this is a real threat, and it shows a little bit of the difference now that in the future might be a problem. The food truck, the fancy food trucks, for lack of a better word, have their own association now, and we work with them. But one of their strategies is very clearly to distance themselves from the traditional immigrant vendors in terms of their image as a business strategy. They don't want to be affiliated with us. So I just want to talk quickly about a successful campaign. So what is what's the upshot here? Where's the hope of you know, you vendors, you're a bunch of immigrants, you don't have any power, most of you are not citizens, you can't vote, you're not really part of the political process. How can we change that? Well, we have one successful example that I want to just mention. A biggest problem we have are tickets that the city gets. Here's a picture of a confiscation going on, but about 40,000 tickets written to vendors every year, and that's not counting the criminal court tickets. So what there's a box of tickets, you see, that's like, some of the tickets that we get at our office. And so we started a campaign at City Council to lower the price of the tickets, not just the number of tickets. The tickets were up to $1,000 for one ticket, for one of these little offenses, like having your license in your pocket, as opposed to you're supposed to visibly display it while vending. So we went to City Hall, got the different City Council members, and started making a bunch of noise. And look, here's a bunch of, it took us 2 years and change. Finally, we got the majority of the City Council on board. Here's a bunch of our members, a bunch of immigrants, most of them outside of one of the City Council meetings, saying, please call a vote on our bill to lower these fines. But nobody really cared. The City Council didn't really care about a bunch of immigrants outside. Who cares about that? So what do? Well, we realized that actually we have a lot of power. Maybe not our members, the vendors themselves, but the population. Right? Millions of people go to vendors every day and have sometimes a relationship, or at least they walk past the vending carts every day. We've got some of the best real estate in New York City. So we were targeting the Speaker of City Council, Christine Quinn, to call for a vote. And so we said, all right, we got an idea for you, Speaker Quinn. This was a press conference where we announced our new strategy, which was to stick these stickers you'll see with her face, calling for her to call a vote on our bill. This is actually on 23rd Street, right near where she lives, and apparently she walks her dog in the morning, so we were hoping we don't know if she ever saw it, but we stuck these things all over the place. A couple of our board members there are sticking it on a cart. Some of you might have seen these. And then after a couple months of this, they called us up and they said, all right. She's got a mayoral race to run here. She's trying to get the immigrants' votes. She doesn't want to be seen as being unfriendly to immigrants and or small business owners. So they called and said, okay. And just about a month ago, in fact, the City Council passed it. This is from the day. Thank you, Speaker Quinn. And the mayor vetoed it, but in a couple weeks, the City Council, knock on wood, is going to override the veto. It's going to be a huge, really historic victory for the vending community. Vendors have never had this much power. It was after a lot of work, years of work. And thanks very much.
Thank you, Sean, and thanks for sharing this amazing work that you're doing. I was wondering some questions that we could discuss later on. What kind of challenges you face in organizing and bringing together these communities. And yesterday we were talking about, when Saru was talking about rock, things that we can do as customers and people who enjoy food and want to protect the rights of workers. What can we do to support street vendors and make sure that their rights are respected? And finally, just on a logistical note, what happens, how do people get those $20,000 permits? It seems impossible, especially for undocumented workers. How do they get to finance something like that? So maybe I'll open up the floor for questions, but I hopefully we can address that at some point.
Well, should I, maybe it'll come up, or should I run through?
Yeah, let's wait for questions, and then you can come back to that. So please take the microphones on the sides and introduce yourselves when you ask your question, and try to keep it short so we can get as many questions as possible. I don't know. Let me see.
Hello?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Working, yeah.
I made it work. Sean, is for you. I didn't know about that increase. Is that affecting the veterans? My name is Elder Pedro Perez Ortiz. I work with PCUSA and various churches, and various of my members are vendors. And my concern is that we have also veterans in our churches, and we're trying to sort of keep the peace between the belongings and not belongings, you know what I'm saying? But my concern is in terms of that. Also, in terms of the issue of spacing, because I have noticed, like in the area of Lincoln Center, there is a gorgeous Egyptian woman on the middle of an area which I know vendors are not allowed, because I'm from New York City, so I know that geographical and demographical stuff. So and I have, they have all these other vendors where Barnes and Nobles used to be, and it's closed down, and they have the Belgium vendors that I was talking to you about before, but they're in a sort of a truck, and they sort of distance themselves from the vendors of organic foods that happen to cater now to anybody who shows around. It's not like before that I used to have like an area like in 97th Street. So my concern is why, how that those affect, how is the spacing determined? And is it gonna be affected by this Gary guy legislation? Because those are different factors that when they come to talk to us elders that we work with them, we want to explain to them and refer them.
Okay, great. So the first question was about veteran vendors. There's actually a state law which provides a special license preference outside of that cap that I mentioned before for veterans, U.S. military veterans, to sell merchandise. It doesn't apply to food, and so most of the native-born people that you see out there on the street selling merchandise are U.S. military veterans, oftentimes disabled veterans, which is a great program. There's only a couple of veteran vendors now selling food, and it's most of that is only merchandise vendors. And there are some complicated laws we could talk about relating to veteran vendors selling food. As for the spacing, a lot of people ask me, well, why is this vendor in this spot and somebody else is over there? The city does not assign spots to vendors. There's many, you can, in theory, if you have a license and permit, you can go anywhere, except that many streets have been closed off. There's a long list of streets which are closed. Oftentimes it's the more desirable streets, as you might guess. And then on the open streets, there's lots of other rules. You have to be 20 feet from a building entrance and 10 feet from a crosswalk, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's other vendors that might already be there, and the rule, the sort of informal rule, is that you should respect the other vendor's right to, if he was there or she was there first. So all this means that it's hard to find a spot. At at Lincoln Center, I know there's a little park there. The situation in the parks is actually different from the streets. They do bid those spots, and I think there's a tiny park right there that I'm not too familiar with, but the parks system is a straight capitalist system, which says the highest bidder gets the spot. And we think it's actually not worked well in Central Park, where you have a big company that owns all the spots and employs workers at very, in fact, once at minimum wage, below minimum wage, which wasn't good for anybody. And it was really against the spirit of vending, which is that you'd be able to own your own business.
Thank you. We have a question here.
Hello. My name is Lars from Copenhagen, professor in philosophy and sociology, and I would like to go back to the first presentation because you had a lot of statistics there, but I was not totally clear how you used them because there was a big difference between what you called immigrants in New York on the one hand and then United States. So that raised for me to the question from a sociological perspective, what is an immigrant in the United States?
It's simple.
It was not totally clear because if you take your statistics, it was very quick, but I figured out that it's a totally different picture if you look at the general United States statistics compared to the New York statistics. This is the one thing, and this. So I think it's very essential to try to define when. What does it mean to be an immigrant in the United States when we talk about this?
The answer is what the census defines it: the foreign-born, because there are this census statistics on occupations. All that data shows is matching between foreign birth and your current occupation. That's what defines an immigrant in this particular case. And of course, there's a big difference between New York City, in most cases, which at least from about the 1830s onwards has probably about 50% of the population is probably foreign-born. But in this case, it comes from the occupation census. So you mark off your birthplace. So in this case, an immigrant is someone who is born elsewhere and is currently has an occupation in the United States on the date of the census.
Thank you. You come up front if you want to ask a question.
Hi, my name is Cassandra Flexig. Is this on?
I don't think so.
No, I have to. I don't know what to do. Do I have to press something?
It's
Can you hear me?
on?
Oh.
Lean in.
Okay. My name is Cassandra Flexig, and I work for CARP Resources. We're a food consultancy, and I work on healthy food access projects, including the New York City Green Cards Initiative. Can you hear me?
It's phasing out.
I'm
Just
like
give it a little time.
right here. Okay.
You got it. Yep.
Okay, I work for CARP Resources. It's a food consultancy, and I work on healthy food access projects, including the New York City Green Card Initiative, which many of our members, or vendors are street vendor project members, which is great. My question is actually about the food trucks. It was interesting that you said that the influx of the fancy food trucks has increased that black market permit rate from $10,000 to $20,000. And I'm wondering, are the majority, or perhaps all of the food trucks purchasing their permits on the black market? Is the Department of Health doing anything to enforce this? And if not, if they were to enforce this, would that help the broader number of vendors who don't have $20,000 to purchase these permits?
Okay, the first part of that was, are the newfangled fancy food trucks breaking the law by getting their permits on the black market? The answer is yes. That's no secret. Unless they, by definition, unless they've been waiting for 15 or 20 years, they have no other choice. And it's not just them. Many immigrant vendors also buy their permits on the black market. The second part of that was, sorry. Enforcement. The health department knows that this goes on. Everybody knows that this goes on. The health department knows that it goes on especially. They have not exactly said that they don't care, but they've said that their priority is food safety and not whose permit it is, or how much money I'm given or taking back on the black market. So they want to make sure that that food is safe and operated safely, the cart, and the back room, black market, back and forth, whether that's fair or not, is not their priority. So we want them to crack down on that black market. The easiest way to solve the lack of the black market issue is actually to increase the number of permits, or make it so that anybody can get a permit if they want one. Then there wouldn't be a black market. You could just go and apply for a permit, obviously. That's what you can do in LA, for example, and many other cities. There's no limit on the number of permits there. Barring an increase in the number of permits, though, it would be good for the city to, the health department or some other part of the city, to crack down on this market. It's complicated. We have people that are selling their permits on the black market. We have people that are buying. And the people that are buying, as I said, are not necessarily morally culpable, right? They are doing what they have to do. So it's a little tricky to figure out how it might work. But the people who have permits who are not using them should have them taken away from them. It's that simple. And they should be given to the people that need them. That would open up some of the permits. It might drive the price down if there were more permits available that way. And in theory, it would be pretty simple to do. But as I say, the health department has not made it a priority.
So maybe this is a good time to answer the question about how, if it's not in the black market, how do immigrants get the permits, and especially if they're undocumented and they don't have access to financing or getting a loan or something?
Well, often they don't. So everyone you see out there selling from a shopping cart or working on somebody else's cart, oftentimes when you get started, and truck, sure. So often when many of our members, they don't have the money to buy that permit or to buy the physical cart, so they work on somebody else's cart, and until they can hopefully save up enough money to get their own cart, which is, $20,000 for the permit, we know, maybe 10 or 20,000 for the actual metal cart. Then you have to find a spot, so it's not easy, and as a result, many people just don't do it. Well, they can't do it.
And what happens in New York if you're undocumented and you're caught without a permit?
So if you're vending without a permit, you are generally arrested, and knock on wood, we have not seen this affecting anyone's immigration status. Okay. Although, it's never a good thing to be arrested if you're undocumented, and there's great fear in the community about what might happen if that's the case.
Okay, thank you. So we had that one first, and then you.
Hello, my name is Daisy Tam, and I'm from Hong Kong. I work in the Department of Humanities at the Hong Kong Baptist University, and I'm in cultural studies. So my question is about, it strikes me that a lot of immigrants in the world seems to fit or work in a certain occupation, and they're restricted by that due to socio-political reasons. Now, I understand, and listening to today's very interesting papers, and also bearing in mind the ones I heard yesterday, I think food has become one of the ways in which immigrants make do in their lives, in settling in a new city. But I was just, and as important as it is to fight for the rights, and I'm completely for that, and fight for better working conditions, in parallel, I'm slightly worried that it seems to be both a poison and a cure, where they would constantly be still trapped in this environment. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about, if given the choice, perhaps, for immigrants, is this an area where they would like to stay in, or an occupation they'd like to stay in? And I'm not just saying like only in the food business, but maybe, for example, and thinking back to Suru's paper yesterday, why are sort of the more darker skinned you are, the more sort of behind you are in the restaurant business. And does this then become, a poison and a cure? Thanks.
Thank you. I think you can both speak to that if you want.
Two comments related. One, of course, is as you acknowledge correctly, is one has to work. What I love about Sean's work and Saru's work, which you heard yesterday, is that it's use a democracy to transform the legal environment. So if it is at least, if not protective of immigrant rights, you put pressure like Sean's group does in not violating human rights. And so one dimension is that. The second problem, I don't see it as a poison, as a cure. What I see it as, of course, related to social inequalities. And you can work to transform the law to be less exploitative, but you cannot legislate away social inequality. And so you have to, so I agree with you, is in some ways these are part of racial, gender, ethnic hierarchies. And those hierarchies usually cannot be legislated away. So there's no easy solution to it in terms of how not to have, for instance, the example from yesterday, and you can see that in the restaurant business, in a sense, the front of it tends to be white, Anglophone, or Europhones. For instance, if you have a French accent, if you're white, it works very well in the front of the house. Italian now, by the way, that's a beautiful story itself, upward mobility. So Fabio sounds very sexy if you're the front of the house. Indian accent is getting there. So Indian accent is getting there. So I'm waiting for that to happen. And I'll play between my Odia accent and Bengali accent and Hindi accent. So you are pointing to social hierarchies, which we can probably slowly reform and eventually, hopefully, overthrow, but there's no way to legislate it yet.
Yeah, many of our members tell stories when we ask them, how did you get to be a vendor? They literally, arrived here and were walking around on the street and saw somebody that looked like them and said, hey, how did you get into this job? And then they said, oh, yeah, okay, well, I'll take you down here to the garage and we can help you get your license. So there's almost no one would be out there on the street every day and dealing with the weather, on your feet, all the stresses, the police and the ticketing, the enforcement that come with vending unless you had very few other options. Many of our members, they worked or tried to work in a restaurant and were just not able to pay the bills. So I think that vending is somewhat more attractive. Obviously in terms of freedom once you get your own business, but even when you're starting off, less oversight if you're out there on your own at least and your boss is away somewhere. So there's some freedom that's involved that I think is attractive to some people, but mostly they're looking for a job. Most of our vendors are not really, they don't have an entrepreneurial mindset. They're looking for a job to pay their bills and support their family. And when a better job comes, for most of them, some of them are really tied to vending, but many of them go on to be taxi drivers, which is sort of the next step up. You need to pass a test in New York City to prove your English proficiency to get a taxi license, which is why many of our vendors can't drive a taxi. But some of our more sort of special people, often we lose them, if you will, to the taxi industry. So there's always more people to replace them.
They can drive the taxi, they cannot get the license.
So let me go here and then we'll come back to you. Is that okay?
Sure. Sorry, I have to adjust this down, all the way down.
Mm-hmm.
This question is, it pertains to your work, actually, both of you here on the right. My question is, I've been a member of the food media for some time, and I've also had the experience of being an immigrant and working abroad and being part of a sort of disempowered I don't speak the first language of the country experience. So in my work, and especially if I'm reporting on a restaurant, it's really important to me to be able to interview the owner of the restaurant to get their story and not to, as you said, separate the food as object from the person who's making it. To me, I think that's a really important part of the story. And even if there's a language barrier, you know, as your work demonstrates, I think that if this is your professional work, you try to find ways around it, and you try to be resourceful. But I think that you know, we've seen an explosion in sort of citizen journalism around food and user-generated content and things like that. And I think that one thing that gets lost is this sense of responsibility to the maker of the food, that this is part of the story. And I've even seen it in professional news where you have a reporter going to report on, I lived in Korea, so they'll go and report on Korean food. And they will completely lack a sense of what's appropriate in Korean culture, why they're being treated this way, why this thing happens, why this dish shows up, or why the waitress acts this way. And that will make it into the story in a negative way. So I think that it also, you see this hierarchy of whatever is closest to the Anglo-American experience is rated more highly, as this is, I was comfortable here. And, you know, experiences where it's very scary or intimidating, or perhaps the owner of the restaurant isn't available to speak in English and explain and put this stuff in context. I really see those restaurants sometimes really suffering. And I was wondering if you might have any sort of simple suggestions for everyday people who are interested in talking about food, engaging with vendors, regardless of the language barrier. How would you recommend that we kind of close that gap, that regular people can kind of make these connections when they want to write about a restaurant between the food and the people who make it? How can we kind of take that responsibility upon ourselves as just everyday people? And also, I mean, if there's any other members of the media, this is something I ask myself every day.
Thank you.
It's tough to give up power you have. And, you know, with gender, households, and when you have power, you benefit from it. It's really tough to give it up. And do the dishes and do the cleaning in the house, etc. So in a sense, what you're raising is a very similar question, which is larger social transformation. Can there be techniques? I see there are certain kinds of robustness of the democratization of the media, where you have a lot more noise on one side, but kinds of possibilities, which is exactly what you're talking about in some ways of citizen media, and people like you and other people who would in some ways be in a position to engage in a much more robust way. That's what I would say, that's why I call it the politics of inhabitants. The food is important. If you're a foodie, it's important. If you look for taste, it's important. But it's not the only thing. There's a kind of an object, the downside of an object-oriented fetishism is the inquiry ends there, okay? So perhaps in some ways, one should be attending to that subject-object hyphen in some ways. And that could be productive, where in a sense, questions about the food itself important. And I like that. I like the revolution that's going on around us. Some of it is because it's fashionable. I see very clearly a disintegration of a hierarchy of taste since the 18th century, collapse of Western ideas of taste that has been in some ways, in fact, under-theorized on one side. It's a democratic moment, and that's possible, but the downside of being so engaged about cycles of fashion, etc., is anything other than the consuming subject vanishes from our consideration. And can one keep these two in play, which is one attend to the aesthetics of the object, but not let the producing subject vanish from our horizon, even when we recognize that there's no individual way of solving that power question forever. You can only create democratic spaces with organizations, with some amount of consciousness raising. But I think consciousness raising only happens when you're challenged, say by Sean's organization saying, think about it. And you have to fight it legally. And that opens a room, I think, for engagement.
That was well said. you know, I know a lot of people. Myself, often I live alone, and so the first person I see every morning, or certainly talk to, is the woman who sells me coffee every morning, and you know, there's hundreds of people that sell coffee and donuts from coffee donut carts. It's the same, you know. It's fine. It sustains us. It's there. I don't see anyone excited about the bagel they got this morning, and so many people, myself included, might just say, you know, half and half, 2 sugars, and thank you, without taking the time to get to know that. You know, even saying what is your name can be a great way to make that a deeper connection, and then you could go from there. So that person, whether or not the donuts are especially good or not, they sustain us, and I can tell you that that person's story is going to be very fascinating, and you will be enriched by getting to know it a little bit. So that can be one little step that people take. And vendors are often busy, but often they're just standing there. So that's why you should feel comfortable talking to them, in this way, breaking through. The stories are often much more interesting than the taste of the food.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we're going to take 3 questions together so that we have enough time for everyone. So I'll start with you, and don't forget to introduce yourselves, please, and then we'll take these other 2, and then after that, that next 2.
Thank you very much. My name is Consuelo Salas. I am a doctoral student from the University of Texas at El Paso, and I'm pursuing rhetoric and writing studies. So the first presentation really spoke to a lot of my research interests. Particularly, I have a research interest in constructions of authenticity. Where do these concepts come from? And so I was wondering, in your ethnographic research, if the immigrant restaurant owner, these notions of authenticity, how do they play into the way that they're reading these, their audience or their customers? How is that being constructed within, or how are they reading these constructions, and how are these constructions then influencing the way they construct their restaurants?
Okay, thank you. Whoever was next.
Hi, my name is Sarah Khan, and I have a background in public health and nutrition and ethnobotany. And Krishnendu, I've heard you speak before. I've read some of your work, and I very, very much appreciated your talk. And as I look at the thing, it says Center for Public Scholarship, and being an academic, but also writing for popular culture, I so appreciated the nuanced complexity that you offered to the public about South Asia and South Asian cuisines. Because what I often see is a caricature of stereotypes, not just by people who are not from those cultures, but by people from that culture too. And I want to know, as activist scholars, as some of us are, how you negotiate and teach your students or share with vendors in an activist way, breaking down these systems. And it's very much a system. You mentioned gender and patriarchy and other issues, the Anglophile perspective. And how are you teaching, how are you engaging people to when they are invited to conferences, making sure that it is a diversity of people and a diversity of thought, and that structures perpetuate us, you know, always calling it curry, or structures and systems perpetuate these stereotypical ways of looking. And I'd just like you to comment about who or what or how people are trying to engage as academics these questions of when we go into the popular culture.
Okay, one more.
Yeah, my name's Adam Steinberg. I work at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, and I'm also a graduate student in urban geography at Rutgers. I have a question for Sean. I was wondering if you could just speak briefly about what role, if any, business improvement districts play in the regulation or perhaps over-regulation of street vendors in New York City.
Thank you. Do you want to take one more? Or?
Yeah, we can take some.
Okay, one more.
Hello, my name is Victoria Setune. I'm coming from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, with a group coming from the Gettysburg College through the Center for Public Services. And in Gettysburg, we have only 2 vendors at the square and I guess 2 food trucks. So my questions are to Sean, and it's basically, where do the people in New York apply for a vendor permit, and is the application difficult to fill out? And about the black market, I would like to know the price, and if the police or the, I don't know, the health department person comes and asks you for your permit, are they able to identify if it's fake or no? How that, I would like to know a little bit more of that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. By the way, I was just informed that we can spend a few more minutes here, so we will have time to address all your questions and respond to this more fully.
Sean, do you want to go first?
Okay,
Yeah.
so I'll take that last one first because I think it's you know, and we can talk later about the specifics. There's a city licensing center at 42 Broadway where you can go and get your license to sell food. The problem is that permit that we mentioned because the 15 or 20-year waiting list. The police or the health department might come and they'll see that you. I have heard about some fake permits. I don't think it's easy to do, and I've never actually seen a fake permit. The health department's pretty careful about. They have some sort of a hologram or something. I don't know what it is. Anyway, price is about $17,000, $18,000, $20,000 for a 2-year permit now on the black market, and so that's that. But I'm happy to, if you have like specific questions, you know, I can talk later, or you know, you can email us. We'll be happy to talk about that. I'll jump to the question about bids because that was also for me. Bids have played a huge role. So bids are business improvement districts, which are sort of a, not just a merchant association, like a voluntary merchant association, but they're a quasi-governmental created body which has the power to tax local real estate owners to fund what was originally established as like basic city services when in the 70s and the 80s, I guess the city was not providing them, like sanitation. So a bunch of real estate owners from a certain neighborhood got together and said, okay, we're gonna impose a tax on each other and pay for somebody to be out there cleaning the garbage or standing around in the, as like a security guard. The problem is that it gave as you know, the real estate lobby is our opponents. They don't like vendors. They want to control the streets in front of their spaces. And so it's really infused a lot of money and power into the people who are against us, basically. Whereas before the bids were created, there would be voluntary merchant associations, and you know, they have the right to create a voluntary merchant association, and we have a right to create a vendor association, and then let the, you know, let the more powerful group win that debate. But right now, our opponents, if you will, our adversaries are, I think the Downtown Alliance has a budget of $40 million. And that's only in one neighborhood. And so we're really outmatched by a very effective anti-vendor lobbying force who are constantly going to the community boards and the local elected officials and complaining about vendors creating noise or congestion or whatever it might be.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Krishnendu?
Thank you for those questions. I can't answer them, and what I'm going to do is try to say a few things. And then we can carry on the conversation later on. I don't want to take too much time. We'll take all the other questions. First was the question of authenticity. And I, in fact, have stopped arguing against authenticity because I think authenticity is a kind of resource for relatively less empowered immigrant, say, restaurateurs, in my case. Of course, authenticity is a question. I see authenticity as a true copy, right? A true copy of what? A true copy of your experience of that thing, okay? So I've talked about it elsewhere. For instance, I come from Eastern India, from a state of Odisha. And my father is Bengali, and this will partly address Sarah's question too about breaking stereotypes, which is, I'm here when people have questions about dosa, they ask me. I never ate a dosa other than in the marketplace, And I ate hundreds of dosas in Eastern India, presumably by a Tamilian immigrant in a little town called Cuttack. So I don't know nothing about dosa until I ate hundreds of dosas by this guy. And then I went to my friend Ravi Sundaram's house. His grandma made me a dosa. And that dosa had nothing, didn't look anything like the other dosa because it was not stuffed with potatoes and stuff. And then I realized, wow, which one is the damn authentic dosa? The hundreds of dosas I had eaten by a Tamilian immigrant in a street corner in Cuttack, or in a household by the grandma of my friend? By theory, my friend's grandma's dosa at home is the most authentic one, okay? But it was inauthentic as far as my experience was concerned. So in some ways, authenticity, of course, is a relationship. It's a relationship and a reconstruction. It is like heritage. It is, in some ways, you build a relationship with things and people, and it is limited by your limited experience. So in some ways, what it has taught me is to behave better in context, not argue about authenticity of other people's food that I know very little about, okay? Which is authentic, inauthentic. I see that as a kind of resource of negotiation. I'll give you a quick sub-example in that. Lot of restaurants now, or some restaurants now, are in fact beginning to use the authenticity as a resource by immigrants by in fact taking away their sign in English, because they know authentic people, white folks in search of authentic cuisine will go to places and like it more if they don't have a menu in English and you don't have a sign in English. Okay? And so that's a resource they are using in terms of this discursive power of the idea of authenticity and engaging with it. Related with Sarah's question, Sarah, I have to talk to you later. Thanks for such kind comments. I have to talk to you later, but in a sense, how do I get past stereotypes is partly, for instance, in one of the courses on Indian comparative cuisine in India, for instance, that I taught, is I start from, in some ways, interrogating my own biography, okay? What it means to be an Indian. I didn't realize I was an Indian until I left India. And then when I left India and I talked about being Bengali, because that's one of the languages I speak, but it turns out that's only half my heritage, because my dad is Bengali. My mom, in fact, is Odia. So in fact, sometimes I take this position about, so let's take a look at, I start this class on Indian food with Odia cuisine. Nobody has heard about Odia cuisine. I hadn't heard about it. There is no formalization of it other than one self-published cookbook in the Western world by an IBM engineer. And I can see some of my students in the back row there saying, I remember that book. And it's beautiful. I like the terminology. It's Anglophone. I can use it. So I use kind of techniques of displacement to undermine the very thing I'm trying to teach without getting excessively postmodern and incoherent, okay? I always do that, and I kind of, so there's this kind of playing of it. So I start off with Odia cuisine, and in some ways, what does that do? You know what, the most important question is, it in fact poses the question back to myself. It's almost not so much what I'm teaching my students, it's what am I teaching myself about who I am. And the idea that these are all shorthands of in Indian, a Bengali, an Odia, a male, etc., which is of course performative too. It is I am what I do. If I'm doing Odia food today, I'm Odia. Okay, tomorrow if I'm doing Indian food, I'm an Indian. Okay, day after I'm doing Bengali food, I'm a Bengali. So that's all I can do in terms of, I've even written a book called Curried Cultures, the most stereotypical of things you can do about Indian food. And the point is, I'm trying to use it ironically. Sometimes irony can be lost on the audience too.
So let's take all these remaining questions in one and just try to keep them as short as possible so we can address them all. Let me start here because there's more, and then we'll come back.
My name is Trisha. I'm a grad student in public health at Tufts. And my question is actually for Mr. Rai. I was wondering, I was struck by your idea about the necessity of a strong enclave community to support kind of more authentic or legitimate ethnic restaurants. And in concert with the picture that you had, Mr. Basinski, of the Bangladeshi hot dog vendor, who didn't want to sell Bangladeshi food, and I'm wondering, like how there's this strong, you know, maybe that compared to the Ecuadorian immigrants who are able to sell Ecuadorian food to Ecuadorian immigrants, how the politics and spatial relations of where immigrant communities end up kind of dictates aspirations towards assimilation or acculturation.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Simco Horwitz, and I work on food justice issues up in Boston and work with a lot of farmers and food vendors. So I really appreciated your photo of the ticketable offense in Chinatown versus at the Green Market. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to issues of food access as terminology like food deserts has really entered the mainstream, and there are a lot of initiatives to think about ways to increase opportunities for people to access healthy, fresh foods. The extent to which you think the immigrant community is really being able to be included in those discussions, and the strategies that the city wants to take to increase access to healthy fruits and vegetables, and whether or not sort of what's being deemed an appropriate way to increase access, maybe actually leaving out the immigrant vendors.
Thank you.
My name is Brian Grice. I'm a student at Centenary College. I'm a sociology major. My question is to the law about to sell food. It has to be on the table. It has to be official, for lack of better words. But my question is there anything being done to kind of fight for the rights as people to be like, look at all the tickets that are being put in this area and nowhere else. Like, why are these the only people being targeted for doing it the wrong way? But these people are doing it the wrong way, but it's okay because the people they know and the people that are buying it from them, not just people like,
Thank you.
My name is Lauren Cisneros, and I'm an AmeriCorps Vista serving here with the New York City Coalition Against Hunger. And Sean's work kind of reminds me of a children's book from the 60s called The Pushcart War, which I see him smile. I really love that book, and it's interesting to me that those kinds of tensions are still happening between the city and the man, maybe, and immigrant pushcart vendors. The question that I have, Krishnendu mentioned that the owner of the first Indian restaurant in that census came to study engineering and ended up owning an Indian restaurant. And I'm just wondering how often that happens today. I mean, I assume that it happens a lot, but I don't work with vendors, and I would be interested to know, maybe not quotable statistics, but just an impression of how often people feel maybe that they are doing something that is so much less than what they were trained for, or what they would like, why they came here. And so just the mobility, I guess. Like, do people stay food vendors for long? Do they pass these permits on to their families? Or do they, what is the longevity of one person in the vendor business? And then my other question is for Sean. As far as you seem to be the unionizing force for the street vendors here in New York City, and I'm just wondering, you mentioned that you do the Vendies in LA and in other major cities, and just what are your partner organizations, I guess, and how far up do you go to represent, in labor, to represent the immigrants?
Thank you. Okay, the final two questions.
Hi, is this working?
You can just hold it.
All right. My name is Rachel Lears. I'm a documentary filmmaker and a cultural anthropologist, and I'm currently working on a documentary about the story of the Hot and Crusty Workers Association, a group of undocumented immigrants at a bakery on the Upper East Side who last year formed an independent union, survived a lockout, and won a contract. So my question is more of a comment that I would love to hear some responses to, dealing with the issue of that was raised in the last question as well, about immigrants who may feel stuck in low-wage food industry jobs when in fact they have aspirations towards something else. A lot of the workers that I've worked with at Hot and Crusty originally wanted to be lawyers, or they are currently studying to finish college degrees. You know, there's a range of different life stories, but what organizing is about for them, it's about two things. It's about improving their material conditions, of course, but it's also about dignity. And both of these forms of empowerment have consequences for larger social transformation, both in their own lives and for their entire families. families and communities as they become leaders in these struggles. And in addition, the larger low-wage food industry and all service sector organizing community, one of the main goals is to, imagine a world where these low-wage, minimum wage jobs were actually transformed into living wage jobs through policy changes, and which would only happen because of organizing. This process would lift millions of people out of poverty. It would be analogous to what happened with industrial jobs in the beginning of the 20th century. And I guess, the idea is that this type of empowerment can have consequences for larger social transformation across generations. So I'm just wondering if anyone has comments on that.
Thank you. Can you just give it to the next question?
Hi, my name is Inerica.
I'm beginning to forget the questions. Okay, yes.
I am studying international studies at Ramapo College, and the question is very similar to Trisha's, and it's for both of you. I would be interested to know how you think the vendors and restaurant owners identify themselves through the food that they sell. And you mentioned that the Bangladesh vendor did not want to sell Bangladesh food, and do you think that if that's a process, step towards assimilation, or just to sell more?
Okay, thank you. Thank you everyone for enriching this panel with such great questions. And so I'll just give you a minute or two to sort of sum up and maybe not respond to everything, but give some final comments. And if any of you want to talk to the speakers afterwards, I'm sure they'll be available for a few more minutes to talk to you individually.
Do you want to go first, or shall I go?
I'll try to knock a few of them out, maybe.
Yeah. You want to go?
Sure.
Okay, let me go then. Okay,
go ahead,
that's
yeah,
fine. Not so much as answers, but terrific questions. One is the question of enclave, authenticity. I'm not sure I'm making the argument that inside an enclave you get more authentic food. You get a certain kind of authentic food. I'll give you an example. When I go to Little India, when I go to Jackson Heights, I get a kind of Indian authentic food, but I get also inauthentic Indian food, meaning it's not my mom's cooking. No matter what they do, they're not going to make me happy about it. Because part of that is a fantasy. Part of that is a reality. And part of that, again, experience and my affective relationship to that experience, okay? My love, hate, dislike, love. It cannot be replicated. So in a sense, honestly, maybe that's the way to answer that question. Every time I eat at an Indian restaurant, I'm more disappointed. Because maybe because it's crappy, or maybe because it cannot reach my affective world of it, and which has something to do also about gender, hierarchy, imagination of it, and domesticity, etc. So I'm not sure I'm making an argument about authenticity and enclave, but I did make an argument about that the Chinese within a larger group, yes, you can find, why we go to Chinatown, why we go to the Chinatown in Flushing, why we go to used to go to Little Italy, etc. So there's an interesting and a complicated relationship, which is linked to the other question, which was about, which is I'm really interested in. Like Muhammad Rasul, to give you an example, does not want his children to cook or be related to it. In fact, it is one of the signs of the immigrant cosmos with less symbolic capital, which is the idea that we want to be like Americans. And you Americans want us to stay like us so that we can provide you with authenticity. Okay, so it's kind of, so that's the tension that's get played out. And then if you're a kid of an immigrant, David Chang, then you go back and play with it. Okay, so it's this dynamic relationship about aspiration, ambition, and you don't want to deal with food because you're stuck in food. I mean, that's why when I was teaching at the Culinary Institute of America, most people in the Culinary Institute of America were in some ways came from a demographic that were not forced to cook to make a living. We could not get black men to come to the CIA, and there was a reason why. Because service is related to servitude in its history. Okay, women in the cooking part of the program, not in the baking pastry, we had real difficulty in recruiting women, because if you're supposed to do something all the time you don't want to go and make a profession out of it if you get an opportunity. So it's this complex negotiation of course, self and others' expectation of who we are and what in terms of mobility and upward mobility. And so, yes, there are questions of underemployment, there are questions of downward mobility, and which is one of the things that happens with immigrants, especially not Anglophone immigrants like me, because I can parlay my English language into, if I'm multilingual and English is one of my language, I have a big advantage. If I am multilingual and all my languages are Hindi, Bengali, Odia, I have a real disadvantage. Okay, so it's a complex play, and we are, of course, embedded in hierarchies, in this case, of orality in the double sense of taste and talk.
Thank you. Sean?
Okay. So let me try to go over a few of those things. I jotted some notes down. Food deserts, some of you may know of that the city of New York established a clever program a few years ago called Green Carts, which was to establish, to raise that permit cap that we talked about, to establish food vending permits for fresh fruits and vegetables in areas that were determined to be food deserts, certain precincts here in the city. It has worked in some respects. That is to say, there are people selling from green carts now in areas where there were not before, so they are distributing fresh fruits and vegetables to these low-income neighborhoods and therefore carrying out the mission. However, we still have that problem of excessive enforcement, which seems to undercut the very purpose. So when you're fining a green cart vendor $1,000 for having that box next to his or her cart, he or she cannot then continue to sell fresh fruits and vegetables to the people that need it. Does everybody know what a mango flower is? A mango flower, that's like when vendors will cut a flower. I think it's maybe Mexican. A Mexican tradition where it's a beautiful flower that you eat, but it's, that is not allowed to be sold by a green cart vendor because it's deemed unsafe because it has been cut. So green cart vendors can only sell fresh fruits and vegetables. You can't sell these beautiful sort of traditional mango flowers, or if you do, that could be a $1,000 ticket very easily. So that's one example. Somebody asked, how do you make very hard to get people who are customers or other people who might care about vendors, how do you get them involved in the process? We don't really expect busy New Yorkers to pick up the phone and call their council member because they heard that their vendor's having a hard time. That really doesn't happen. There has to be other ways. Apart from friending us on Facebook and coming to the Vendy Awards, the job is on us, really, as a community to try to find ways to engage the general public who may love vendors but may not know how to get involved. There was a question about partnerships. Vendors are a very specific group of people who are kind of outside of most of the normal categories, and therefore it's been hard for us to make partnerships, but we're trying. It's somewhat easier to partner with vendor organizations in other cities. There's some real important work being done around the country, perhaps most notably now in Los Angeles, where there's a drive to legalize sidewalk vending, which is currently illegal and is going on right now, being headed up by a group called ELAC. East LA Community Corporation, they're doing some great work. There's a group in Chicago called AVA, Association de Vendedores Ambulantes, that we're also working with, trying to form a more of a national movement for street vendors along the lines of what ROC has created and some other notable exceptions that you guys have might heard about. Worker centers that are working nationally. Domestic Workers United is a great example. So we are looking to those very successful groups as models, not labor unions, non-traditional worker centers who are doing work on the national level. And finally then, there was a question about dignity. And it's true, many of our vendors were lawyers or engineers in their home countries, and I'm sure that they are not so proud to be vendors. In their countries, remember, the vendors are really the poorest of the people, and they probably see themselves as better than that. We don't talk about it too much, but it does come through at least in one area. I think a lot of our vendors, a lot of immigrants maybe have internalized, they've accepted the fact that they are not going to be a lawyer in this country. And so they see their dreams maybe through their children. That's how they channel that energy or that frustration maybe into imagining that their children might be better, even though they've accepted the fact that they... Right. And so one thing as a final thought that it comes through in this idea of dignity that comes through so often, we hear so many stories about vendors who are bothered by simply not the fact that they're getting tickets, yeah they are, or the fact that the tickets are so expensive, but simply by the way the police talk to them. And the give me your license, you know, as opposed to excuse me sir or ma'am, may I see your license please, is something that we just hear over and over, and it gets to our vendors in such a very deep way. We try to work with our vendors to explain that vending is has a very proud tradition here. They should be proud to be vendors, and yet when they're confronted with that sort of treatment every day, I think that's what gets to them in a way which is very deep, and only by changing the way that vendors are treated will we be able to resolve that issue.
I just want to give a quick citation for the data. It comes from the Minnesota Population Center. It's called the Integrated Public Use Microdata Series. So if you go to the website, IPUMS is the short form for the census data on occupations and birthplace. And it's machine readable data. I had to look up my citation in that, so sorry I didn't. Thank you.
Okay, please join me in thanking the panel. And Fabio wants to give an announcement.
A brief announcement. Here in the courtyard, as you exit the theater, you turn left, we have a courtyard, and we have this installation focusing on food delivery workers. So we have bicycles, and starting from 1:30, we will have actually a conversation with the bicycle deliverers. So you're all invited to see the installation, speak with the workers starting at 1:30. Also, food-wise, there are lots of offerings, and you can also buy food in the cafeteria, which is across the courtyard. So it's all here. We'll reconvene here at 2:45. We have 4 presentations in the next panel, so we'll start at 2:45 promptly. Thank you. Oh, and by the way, take the little paper that is connected with the installation, and it explains, you know, its reason, its origin, and lots of information about deliveries.